1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own.
Hi, warriors. Welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host, Ingrid. I'm going to be honest, some of these stories are more difficult to get through than others. Of course, when the violence escalates to murder, it leaves a lasting impression. The impression that really any domestic violence situation could end tragically in death. But that's why these accounts are so important to share. This is the story of Kirsty Wilkinson. Kirsty was born June 19, 1984, making her the third daughter born to Kathy. Sonia was the oldest by about 6 years. Haley and Kirsty were a little over a year apart in age and were almost inseparable. Because of the psychological and emotional abuse he inflicted on her, Kathy asked Fred, the biological father of the youngest two girls, to leave when Kirsty was just a few months old. He obliged. Eventually, Kathy found and married Dave, a kind man who became a loving father to Sonia, Haley, and Kirsty. As the years went by, the girls left home one by one. Kirsty was the youngest and the last to leave. She went with excitement and determination to become a model, and she was doing just that, even traveling abroad. She eventually took an additional job at a massage parlor. Unbeknownst to her family at the time, Kirsty began sex work while there. It was later discovered that the madam of the parlor had threatened Kirsty with losing her job and her home if she quit working as an escort. Kirsty's time working in the parlor isn't the focus of this story, however. In fact, Kirsty desperately wanted a different life. Her family remembers her as lively, outgoing, beautiful, kind-hearted, and gentle. She absolutely fancied the color pink. So much so, her mother lovingly referred to her as her pink princess. Kirsty had been in a 2-year relationship with a young man named Johnny, whom Kathy and Dave adored when she called to let them know she was getting married. Kathy was ecstatic during that January 2008 phone call until Kirsty broke the news. It was not Johnny she was planning to marry. Instead, it was someone named Paul Grabham. Dave and Kathy had never met Paul. In fact, never even recalled mention of him. Kirsty gushed on to explain the two had a one-night stand years prior and ran into each other again at a party. They hit it off immediately. The wedding was set to happen in just 5 weeks. Stunned, Kathy listened as Kirsty explained she would bring Paul to meet them in the next few days. Paul was not what Kirsty's parents were hoping for. Their first impression was that he was scruffy, unkempt, and had bad teeth. Kathy described him as a real Jack-the-Lad. He was unemployed and had already moved in with Kirsty, who was making a good living. But he quickly explained he would be able to secure a job because at the young age of 23 years, he was trained as a professional chef, plumber, mechanic, gas fitter, male stripper, and a race car driver. Obviously, there were red flags at every turn. Dave and Kathy were concerned and begged Kirsty to slow things down. Could they push a wedding back even just a few months? Kirsty, wanting the life of wife and eventually mom, brushed off her parents' concerns. She assured them Paul was the love of her life and they would be happy together. When discussing the wedding with Sonia and Haley, they too voiced concerns. Nonetheless, the wedding was on track to happen. On February 16th, a pink limousine arranged by Dave arrived to take the pink princess and her family to her wedding. Surprising her family, the first few weeks of the marriage seemed to be peaceful and even happy. Now, let's learn a little bit more about Paul Grabham. He had no friends. A later investigation into his life by a psychologist revealed he didn't do well in school, had a poor education, and was always in trouble. That same forensic psychologist described him as egocentric, narcissistic, a liar, and displayed general antisocial traits. A former neighbor labeled him as strange. She also detailed an encounter when he perceived she had done damage to his car. In retaliation, he blocked her pathway holding a bat as she was driving. She turned around to drive away. He pursued her and attempted to run her off the road, causing her to crash into a brick wall. Paul was also working as an escort at the massage parlor, and that is where he and Kirsty actually became reacquainted in 2008. Kirsty thought Paul truly loved her, and she was eager to start a life with a man who would never judge her previous profession. But that wasn't the case. He, in fact, used her history as an escort to exert power and control over her. He would force her to have sex with others. He even created websites to advertise her services to both men and women. Then he would use the experiences as more ammunition to verbally abuse her. He found a way to control her body, and, as his wife, he now felt he owned her. The blissful, newlywed life obviously didn't last. Kathy noticed after just a few weeks that Kirsty's demeanor was different during their daily calls. Paul could be heard in the background directing Kirsty's responses. Kathy also felt he may have been listening in on the conversations. A few months after the nuptials, Kirsty's oldest sister Sonia, along with her husband John, had a christening for their daughters. Later that evening, Kirsty and Paul returned to Sonia's home, clearly arguing. He called Kirsty a slag. Dave had to physically force Paul outside and lock him out of the house. As he began to pound and kick the door, Kirsty went out to him. After this encounter, Sonia informed Kathy of something Kirsty had previously disclosed to her. Paul and Kirsty were at a party together a few weeks earlier. He had taken her into a room, pushed her onto the bed, and pinned her down by sitting on her. Then he strangled her. He squeezed his hands around her throat and wouldn't let go. Fearful she was losing her life, Kirsty ended up wetting herself during the ordeal. Thankfully, someone came into the room and pulled him off. As I mentioned in the last episode, violence and aggression doesn't typically begin at this level. When considering they had just been married a few months when this happened, one can only assume Kirsty was suffering varying degrees of abuse from nearly the beginning. With this new information arming them, Kirsty's mom, dad, and sisters would plead with her to leave Paul. But Kirsty stood firm, stating she took her marriage vows seriously. The abuse continued, and Kirsty continued to forgive. She wanted to help Paul change. Then, Kirsty found out he had been having sex with a woman he met online. Then, she found out he was on dogging sites. I didn't know what that was, and in case you don't either, here it is. Dogging is where people meet up to have sex in public places while others watch. Note that Paul wasn't just browsing through the websites. He was actually meeting up to have sex. Finally, by December, Kirsty decided she had had enough. She told her family she was planning on leaving Paul. The excitement they felt was soon smothered as Kirsty apparently changed her mind and decided to try again. A few more months went by. On March 22nd, Kirsty visited Kathy for Mother's Day. To Kathy's surprise, Kirsty appeared in jogging pants and a hooded sweatshirt. She had her hair pulled back and no makeup on. This was a look that was not normal for Kirsty. Her personality was also different, almost defeated. When Paul arrived to pick her up, Kirsty hurried out to meet him. Kathy followed to give her daughter a hug and kiss. It would be the last time she saw her pink princess alive. Over the next week, mother and daughter continued their daily calls and text messages. Kirsty was staying with a friend because she again was intending to leave Paul. She made plans to go out with some friends on a Friday night in March. She asked Paul to bring her home so she could change there. He ended up going out with her that night as well. The two reportedly were drinking and using cocaine. Paul, in his intoxicated state, knocked over everyone's drinks at the club. He and Kirsty had a disagreement, and she told him to go home. The downstairs neighbors saw Paul stumble out of his taxi into his flat. Continuing to drink, he also phoned his dealer to get more cocaine. Meanwhile, Kirsty stayed out, eventually ending up at a friend's house. She confided in that friend she was leaving Paul, but had to arrange for it to happen at just the right time. That night wasn't it, and despite her friend's attempt to persuade her to stay, Kirsty took a taxi home. The same neighbors who witnessed Paul return home heard Kirsty go up the stairs, calling out to her cat. She texted her friend to let her know she arrived home safely and that Paul was passed out on the couch. Now the neighbors had become accustomed to hearing arguments from Paul and Kirsty's flat. Later, they testified hearing arguing that night, followed by a high-pitched scream from Kirsty, then silence, then a dragging sound. Then drawers being slammed, opened, and closed. 2 days later on Monday, Paul began to call people asking if they had heard from or seen Kirsty. Kathy told him to report her missing to the police. She placed a follow-up call letting them know the kind of person Paul was and her concerns. Paul denied having a disagreement with Kirsty that Friday night. He mentioned noticing some of her belongings were missing. Her hair straightener, but not her brush. Some money, but not her debit card. Clothes she had ironed and folded at the end of the bed. None of this sounded right to her mom or sisters. Wednesday, Kirsty's debit card was used by Paul. He withdrew money to have parties at the flat, buy drugs and alcohol, and pay for prostitutes. On Thursday, police arrested Paul with suspicion of murder. They had found out Kirsty had attempted to call 999 in the early hours of Saturday, March 28, 2009, but the call was interrupted. On Monday, April 6th, the detectives returned to the home of Kathy and Dave. A body of a young woman had been discovered. The next day, the family had the painful duty to identify the body. Kathy looked on at the beaten face. Her eyes were so swollen and bruised, her eyelashes weren't visible. Her jaw was clearly broken. Scratches covered her face. Fingerprint bruises remained on her cheeks. Her nose was grazed and broken. Bits of blood remained crusted in her hair. Kathy didn't recognize her daughter, but Sonia and Dave confirmed it was indeed Kirsty. Paul's trial began on January 12, 2010. On February 4, 2010, after deliberating under 10 hours, the jury found Paul guilty of murdering his wife. The testimonies, interviews, and evidence revealed the following scene. And please listen with discretion as this part is extremely graphic. Paul ferociously beat Kirsty in the head with an object, possibly her hair straightener. He attacked her so brutally there was blood spatter found on the ceiling, in the entryway, on the sofa, under the sofa, on the TV, on the radiator, in the bathroom, in Paul's necklace, and on his cardigan. He strangled her. He initially tried to cut her in half to fit her into a small suitcase. He was not successful, but managed to shove her still warm body into the bag. He hauled her down the stairs and put her into the trunk of her own car. Then he drove and threw the suitcase and Kirsty along the side of the M4 in Wales, just a few miles from her mother's house. He returned home and attempted to clean the mess. A mop and bucket were found with Kirsty's DNA on it. He apparently threw out the rug and painted the ceiling. Hours later, he was searching online for sex. Despite all the evidence and testimonies, Paul maintained his innocence. He claimed everyone else was lying. He said he was asleep on the couch when someone came into the flat, murdered Kirsty, and cleaned up. Thankfully, the jury knew who the real liar was. The judge sentenced Paul to life in prison. Taking into consideration the recommended minimum of 15 years served, he added on another 4 due to Paul's clear lack of remorse. Kirsty kept a journal. She wrote how she wanted to get out of sex work. She wanted to start a family. She wondered how Paul could want another man to touch her. She was too afraid of him to leave. She feared what he would do to her every day he came home. She wrote out the details she wanted for her own funeral. The 24-year-old wanted a pink coffin, to be dressed in pink, have pink flowers, for everyone else to wear pink, and to have her wedding and engagement rings removed. This legitimate fear plays into why victims don't leave or can't leave. The fact that there are so many more trapped in similar scenarios is why these stories need to be told. To end this heartbreaking episode, I'm going to read a poem found in Kirsty's journal titled, My Mom. A mom is God's love in action. She looks with her heart and feels with her eyes. A mom is a bank where her children deposit all their worries and hurts. A mom is the cement that keeps her family together, and her love lasts a lifetime. Thank you for listening. Sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Next week, I'm happy to bring you a conversation with Michelle Horton. She is the sister of Nicole Altamondo and author of Dear Sister, a memoir of secrets, survival, and unbreakable bonds. If you want to refamiliarize yourself, I covered Nicole's story in episode 19. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember you are not alone.
Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1in3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1in3podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1in3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.